Chapter 7. Manœuvering. As the rain pattered against the wooden cover overhead, Harguth and Zul'jin sat with a group of young Orclings, who were up well past their bedtime. The two chiefs were sharing wisdom and stories with the Orclings, as the fire flickered and crackled in front of them. The simple, but practical shelter provided protection from the elements as the Orcs sat and listened to the tales of battles and hunts that Harguth and Zul'jin had experienced. The Orclings listened wide-eyed, entranced by the stories of their leaders and the traditions of their people. "We must be careful in our maneuvering," Harguth said, gesturing to the fire with a shrug of his shoulders. "The terrain and the weather can be used to our advantage, but we must always consider the enemy's movements as well." Zul'jin nodded in agreement. "It is important that we understand the strengths and weaknesses of our opponent and use them to our advantage. We must also be unpredictable in our tactics and not be too predictable in our plans." The Orclings chime in with their own questions and clarifications. One asks, "So if the enemy expects us to move in one direction, we should move in another?" Harguth smiled and nodded. "That is correct. We must stay one step ahead of our opponents and be prepared for any situation." He then looked at Zul'jin and added, "But we must also remember that unpredictability can lead to mistakes, so be sure to plan carefully." "In war, the chief is the one who receives commands from the deity," Harguth said, gesturing with his hand in a sign of strength. "We must always remember this and keep it close to our hearts if we are to be successful in battle." Zul'jin nodded in agreement, his face serious. "Indeed, we must heed the will of Tempest, for only then can we hope to prevail over our enemies." He paused for a moment before adding, "We must also make use of our knowledge of the enemy, for that is key to victory as well." The young Orclings around the fire murmured in agreement, and Zogger asked, "What more can we do? How can we use our intelligence and knowledge to our advantage?" Harguth smiled and nodded at the young Orc. "We must use every tool at our disposal, both physical and mental. We must study our enemies and their tactics, and use our own strategy to counter them. We must also take into account the terrain and weather, as they can be just as important as any other factor in war. It is of utmost importance that we plan and organize our forces," Harguth said solemnly. "We must ensure that all of our warriors are in harmony and working together towards a common goal." He paused for a moment, then continued, "We must also make sure that we use the terrain to our advantage, and that our camp is pitched in such a way as to give us an edge over our enemies." Zul'jin nodded in agreement before responding, "Indeed. We must also take into account the different strengths and weaknesses of our army, and use these to our advantage. We must be aware of our enemies' movements and anticipate their strategies." The Orclings around the fire listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Zogger, the young hunter, asked, "How can we best prepare ourselves for battle? What should we focus on?" Harguth smiled at the eager Orcling and said, "We must practice and hone our skills in battle, both individually and as a group. We must also have a good understanding of the terrain and our enemy, so that we can better anticipate their moves and counter them. And most importantly, we must remain united and focused on our goal." "Tactical maneuvering is the most difficult part of war," Harguth said, glancing at Zogger with a slight nod. "It's about turning misfortune into gain and making the most out of any situation." "That's right," Zul'jin agreed. He gestured with his hands to emphasize his point. "We must be able to think on our feet and use our wits if we are to win this war." He paused for a moment before adding, "And remember that even in the darkest hour, there is always hope." Harguth nodded in agreement, "Aye, Zul'jin. We must be crafty and use our intelligence to outwit the enemy. We must trick them into thinking we are going one way, when in reality we are going another." He gestured with his hands as he spoke, emphasizing his words. Zul'jin responded, "Indeed, it is important for us to think ahead and plan our strategies carefully. We must use the terrain and our knowledge of the enemy to our advantage, and take a circuitous route if necessary." He looked around the campfire, making sure everyone was paying attention before continuing. "We must also remember that our strength lies in our numbers, and so we must be sure to deploy our forces strategically." The Orclings nodded in admiration, their eyes wide. Zul'jin looked around the campfire and said, "Maneuvering with an army is advantageous, with an undisciplined multitude, most dangerous." He gestured to the surrounding Orclings, who had been listening in on the conversation. Your warriors must be trained and disciplined if we are to succeed in battle. Harguth nodded in agreement, his eyes glinting in the firelight. You're right, Zul'jin, he said, his voice low and serious. We must teach our warriors to follow orders and use strategy in order to gain an advantage over our enemies. He paused for a moment, then added, we must also remember that victory comes not from numbers alone, but from intelligence and ingenuity. We must be swift and decisive in our actions, Harguth said. If we send a fully equipped army to seize an advantage, it may be too late by the time they arrive. But if we detach a smaller, faster force, we can sacrifice some of their supplies to ensure they reach their destination quickly. Zul'jin nodded and added, and we should also remember that speed is not always the answer. We must take our time to plan carefully, or else we risk making mistakes that could cost us dearly. The young Orclings in the campfire circle chirped in agreement, adding, yes, grandfather. Haste makes waste. But we must also remember the ancient Orcish wisdom of, to push too hard is to break the back, Harguth warned. If we order our men to roll up their buff coats and make forced marches without halting day or night, covering double the usual distance at a stretch, doing 100 miles in order to wrest an advantage, the leaders of all our 3 divisions will fall into the hands of the enemy. Zul'jin nodded, his hand absent-mindedly rubbing at his chin. You are right, Harguth. We must balance our desire for victory with the well-being of our troops. We must not sacrifice their strength and stamina for a short-term gain. Harguth nodded in agreement. We must also remember the wisdom of, to preserve oneself, one must preserve the army. The 2 orcs sat in silence for a moment, contemplating their next move. The fire crackled and popped, casting a warm glow over their faces. We will be victorious, Harguth said with conviction, if we plan and fight with intelligence, strength, unity and preservation. Zul'jin grinned, agreed. Both orcs slammed their hands together in a sign of agreement, the sound echoing through the forest. It is important to remember that we must use our resources wisely, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands. The stronger men will be in front and the jaded ones will fall behind, so that only 1/10 of our forces will reach their destination on a forced march. He paused, looking around the fire at the young Orclings before continuing. We must also remember that no matter how powerful our forces, they are still vulnerable. We must be prepared for any eventuality. Zul'jin nodded in agreement. Yes, it is wise to plan for any eventuality. It is also important to remember that we have a limited number of resources and should not waste them on unnecessary battles. He glanced around the fire, meeting the eyes of the young Orclings before adding, and don't forget that courage and strength will always be our greatest allies. Yes, that is true, Harguth said, nodding his head. The ancient Orcish wisdom teaches us to use our resources wisely and to be mindful of the amount of effort we expend. We must think carefully before committing our forces to a lengthy march. He paused for a moment and glanced at Zul'jin. If we march 50 miles in order to outmaneuver the enemy, we risk losing the leader of our 1st division as well as half of our force. We must be careful not to overextend ourselves. We must consider our resources carefully and use them to our advantage, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands. If we march the usual 30 miles with the same objective, 2/3 of our army will arrive while the other third will be delayed by the terrain. Zul'jin nodded in agreement, adding, we must also take into account that some of our forces may become lost or injured along the way. We must plan for these eventualities and ensure that our army is well prepared for battle. The young Orclings around the fire listened intently, eyes wide with admiration. Zogger spoke up then, asking, what if we do not have enough warriors to march 30 miles? Harguth looked at Zogger and smiled, that is a good question, my young friend. We must remember that numbers are not the only factor in determining success. We must use our intelligence, knowledge, and resourcefulness to make the most of what we have. Indeed, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands for emphasis. Without the proper supplies and resources, an army cannot survive. We must be sure to take into account our provisions, our bases of supply, and our ability to transport them. He paused for a moment, then added, we must also remember that an army without its baggage train is lost, without provisions it is lost, without bases of supply it is lost. Zul'jin nodded in agreement, adding, we must also be mindful of our enemies, and use our intelligence and knowledge of them to our advantage. We must know their strengths and weaknesses, and use them to our benefit. The Orclings around the fire murmured in agreement, prompting Zogger to raise his hand and ask, "What about morale? Surely, morale will play a role in winning this war." Harguth smiled at the young orc and nodded. "You are very perceptive, Zogger. Yes, morale will be a great factor in this war. We must ensure that our troops remain motivated and unified, and that they have faith in our cause. If we can do this, then we will be victorious." "We cannot enter into any alliances," Harguth said, gesturing with his hands to emphasize his point, "until we are familiar with the plans of our enemies. We must learn their intentions and strategies, and use that knowledge to our advantage." Zul'jin nodded in agreement, then added, "We must also be wary of those who may seek to deceive us. We must be vigilant and trust no one until we have established a true understanding of their motives and goals. We are not fit to lead an army on the march unless we know our country like the back of our hand," Harguth said, gesturing with his hands for emphasis. "We must be familiar with the face of the land, its mountains and forests, its pitfalls and precipices, its marshes and swamps." Zul'jin nodded in agreement and added, "Yes, and we must also understand the enemy's tactics and strategies, so that we can prepare accordingly." He paused for a moment before continuing, "We must also take into consideration the weather and other elements, as they can influence our success or failure." Harguth nodded and said, "Indeed. We must be prepared for anything that comes our way." The two chiefs shared a glance and then looked to the young Orclings gathered around them, who were listening in rapt attention. Harguth smiled at them and said, "You see, my young ones, war is more than just fighting, it is about knowledge, strategy, and preparation. We must use our intelligence and knowledge of the enemy to our advantage," Harguth declared, gesturing emphatically with his hands. "But we cannot turn natural advantages to account unless we make use of local guides." He looked around the fire at the other orcs, including Zogger. "Do any of you know anyone who can help us in this regard?" Zul'jin nodded in agreement and added, "Yes, we should seek out those who know the terrain and the capabilities of the enemy forces. They can tell us where to position our troops and what strategies might best be employed against them." Grommack spoke up from the shadows, his voice gruff, but thoughtful. "Drogothar is an experienced hunter, and his knowledge of the land may prove invaluable. I believe he is willing to join us if we need him." The other orcs murmured in agreement, and Zogger added, "I have heard that Drogothar is a formidable warrior as well. We could certainly use his skills in battle." Harguth nodded slowly, considering the suggestion. "Then it is settled. We shall seek out Drogothar and enlist his aid. He may be just the orc we need to tip the scales in our favor." "It is true," Harguth said, gesturing with his hand for emphasis. "We must use our wits and not move unless there is a real advantage to be gained. We must also remember to practice dissimulation if we are to succeed in this war." Zul'jin added, "Yes, it is important to remember that the enemy is always watching and waiting for us to make a mistake. We must stay one step ahead of them at all times." The two chiefs continued discussing their plans for the upcoming battle, punctuating their words with occasional grunts and gestures of understanding. The Orclings, who had been listening intently, piped up occasionally with clarifying questions which were quickly answered. As they talked, the moonlight shone brightly on the campfire, casting shadows and creating a peaceful atmosphere. Zul'jin grunted, "It is true that the decision of whether to concentrate or divide our forces must be decided by the situation at hand. We must not become complacent and think one strategy will work for all situations." He then added with a stern look, "We must also remember that even if we are outnumbered, we can still prevail with careful planning and preparation." Harguth nodded, his hands forming an ancient orcish gesture of strength. "Yes, Zul'jin, you are correct. But we must also remember that our resources are limited and that we must use them wisely." He looked around the campfire at the young Orclings, who had been listening to the conversation intently. "Our victories will come from being smart, calculating, and having courage," he says with conviction. "Rapidity and compactness, as ancient wisdoms have said," Harguth nodded. "We must be swift and efficient. We should move our forces swiftly and decisively, like the wind, and keep them close together, like the trees of a forest." He paused for a moment before continuing, "Our forces should be able to respond quickly and effectively, no matter the situation." Zul'jin nodded and added, "We must also use the terrain to our advantage. Forests, mountains, and rivers can all be used to our benefit if we are strategic in our movements. The Orclings around the fire listened intently, Zogger asking questions about how to fight and defend against the dark mages. Harguth smiled at the young orc and said, "We must remember that knowledge is power. We must learn all we can about our enemies and use it to our advantage. We must also know our own strengths and weaknesses, so that we can use them to our advantage as well. We must be like fire in raiding and plundering," Harguth said, gesturing a clenched fist. "But we must also be like a mountain and remain immovable, never wavering from our goals." Zul'jin nodded in agreement, then added, "And we must always remember that the smallest spark can grow into a roaring blaze. We must keep the flame of our spirit alive, no matter the cost." The Orclings around the fire murmured in agreement, and Zogger added, "We must use our strength and cunning to gain the upper hand against our enemies, and never give up hope. Let our plans be as dark and impenetrable as night, and when we move, let it be with the force of a thunderbolt," Harguth said in a low voice, his gaze sweeping over the gathered orcs. He glanced at Zul'jin, who nodded in agreement. "We must use our knowledge of the enemy and the terrain to our advantage, and strike quickly and without mercy." Zogger, the young hunter, spoke up then. "But what about the power of Tempest? Shouldn't we seek her aid?" Harguth nodded and smiled. "Yes, my son. Tempest is a powerful force and should not be overlooked. However, we must remember that she will only lend her aid if it serves her purpose. We must be wise and strategic in our approach, and use her power only when necessary. When we plunder a countryside, let us divide the spoils amongst our people," Harguth said with a gesture of his hand. "And when we capture new lands, let us divide it up into portions for our troops so that they may benefit from their hard work." Zul'jin nodded in agreement and said, "Aye, it is only fair that those who have fought on our behalf should be rewarded for their efforts. Let us ensure that no one is left behind." The Orclings watching the two chiefs nodded in agreement, and Zogger asked, "But what about those who are not warriors? How can they benefit from this?" Harguth smiled and answered, "We must also remember to take care of those who cannot fight. We can provide them with safe shelter and share the spoils with them as well, so that they too can benefit from our victories." "We must plan carefully before we act," Harguth said, making a gesture of strength with his hands. "We must use our intelligence and knowledge of the enemy to our advantage. We must pay close attention to our surroundings and use the terrain to our advantage if we are to win this war." Zul'jin nodded in agreement. "A wise move is worth more than 1,000 swords," he said, making a gesture of victory with his hands. "The best battle plans are forged with brains, not brawn. We must take the time to consider all of our options and make sure that our strategies are sound." Harguth nodded. "We must use our cunning and skill to outwit our opponents. We can be flexible and adaptable, never allowing them to predict our next move." Zul'jin added, "Just as a river changes its course, so too must we be willing to change our tactics when necessary. He who is rigid will eventually break." The Orclings chirped in agreement, nodding their heads. Zogger spoke up, asking, "What if the enemy is too strong for us? How then should we win?" Harguth smiled and replied, "Our strength lies not in numbers or weapons, but in our ability to think. We must use our minds to plan strategies that will confuse and surprise our enemies. We must be like the wind, ever-changing and unpredictable." "It is true that the spoken word does not carry far enough," Harguth said, his voice carrying over the sound of the crackling fire. "But it is also true that banners and flags can be seen from afar. We must use both to ensure that our forces are coordinated and our plans are communicated effectively." He gestured to the young Orclings around the fire, who were listening intently. "We must remember that knowledge is power, and we must use it to our advantage in this war." The Orclings nodded, their eyes wide at the wisdom of the two chiefs. Zogger spoke up then, asking for clarification on the law of army management. "The law of army management speaks of not just banners and flags but also gongs and drums," Harguth explained. "These instruments can be used to signal troops to move or attack, or even to alert them of danger. They are powerful tools that can help us win this war." He looked around the fire, making sure everyone was paying attention. "We must use all our resources wisely if we are to emerge victorious." "Gongs and drums, banners and flags," Harguth began, gesturing to the fire with his hands. are tools we can use to draw our forces together and to direct them towards a single purpose. They are a way to focus the ears and eyes of our people on one point. Zul'jin nodded, adding, "We must also be mindful of our enemies and use our intelligence and knowledge of their tactics to our advantage." He glanced around at the Orclings, who were beginning to look sleepy, and smiled. "Never forget that even the smallest of details can give us an edge in battle. It is said," Harguth began, "that a single unified body is unstoppable. We must use our forces in the most advantageous positions to gain victory. It is not enough for the brave to advance alone, nor for the cowardly to retreat alone." He paused, looking at each of them in turn before continuing. "This is the art of handling large masses of men." Zul'jin added, "We must be mindful of our surroundings and use the terrain to our advantage if we are to win this war. Our intelligence and knowledge of the enemy will also be a great asset." Grommack, who had been listening quietly from the side, stepped forward and declared, with the blessing of Tempest, "Our combined strength is sure to prevail." The Orclings cheered in response, and Harguth smiled, raising his hand in a gesture of victory. "Let us hope that our combined strength will bring us victory," he said. Zul'jin looked to Harguth and said, "In battle, we must use our signals, drums, flags and banners to influence the ears and eyes of our army. We should use fire and smoke to guide their movements, and drums to sound our commands." Harguth nodded. "We should also use the terrain to our advantage. By using the right tactics, we can achieve victory over our enemies." The young Orclings around the fire murmured excitedly in response to the wise words of their elders. Zogger, a young hunter from the tribe of Harguth, asked, "What other strategies should we consider when fighting at night?" "At night, we should make use of signals such as fire and smoke," Harguth replied, gesturing with his hands. "We should also use drums to signal our movements and for communication between our forces. This will help us move quickly and efficiently in the dark." "A great army is nothing but a collection of individuals," Harguth said, gesturing with his hands. "Each soldier must be aware of their own strengths and weaknesses, as well as those of the enemy." Zul'jin nodded in agreement, adding, "It is not enough to simply have strength, we must also have the presence of mind to use it wisely and strategically." Harguth nodded, then looked into the fire thoughtfully. "The ancient Orcish wisdoms tell us that a whole army may be robbed of its spirit, a commander-in-chief may be robbed of his presence of mind." He glanced at Zogger, who had been listening intently. "We must never forget this lesson if we are to prevail in battle. It is said that a warrior's spirit is strongest in the morning," Harguth began, nodding to Zul'jin. "By midday, it will start to weaken, and by nightfall, his only thought will be of returning to camp." Zul'jin nodded in agreement, "Yes, this is true. We must use our strength wisely, and not expend it recklessly." He gestured to the Orclings around them, who had been listening intently. "When we go into battle, we must remember that we are fighting for something much greater than ourselves. It is important that we remain aware of our enemy's state of mind and take advantage of any weakness or sluggishness they may show," Zul'jin said. Harguth gave a grunt of approval. "We must also be mindful of our own morale and ensure it remains high. We must stay vigilant and keep our wits sharp if we are to prevail in this war." At this moment, Zogger interrupted the conversation, asking, "What can we do to make sure our spirits remain keen and our minds sharp, Chief?" Harguth thought for a moment before responding. "We must practice discipline and focus on our training. We must also keep our spirits high by celebrating our victories and honoring our ancestors." He then added with a smirk, "And perhaps have a few drinks around the campfire now and then. We must remain disciplined and calm, so that we can take advantage of any disorder or confusion amongst the enemy," Harguth said. He gestured with his hands as he spoke, emphasizing his point. Zul'jin agreed. "Indeed. We must be prepared to act swiftly when they are disorganized and vulnerable. To be near the goal while the enemy is still far away, to wait in comfort while the enemy labors and strives, to be well fed while our foes starve," Harguth said, gesturing with his hands for emphasis. "This is the art of husbanding our strength." "It is indeed," Zul'jin agreed. "We must use our resources wisely and make sure we are prepared when the time comes to face our enemies." The Orclings began to fidget as the discussion continued, and one of them spoke up. "What does husbanding our strength mean?" he asked. Harguth smiled at the young Orc. It means that we must be wise in how we use our resources, so that we have enough energy and strength to fight when the time comes, he explained. We must conserve our energy and plan carefully, so that we can be victorious in battle. Zul'jin nodded and said, "It is indeed the art of studying circumstances. To attack an army that is ordered and confident could be disastrous for us. We must know when to wait and when to strike." Harguth agreed, adding, "We must also take into consideration the terrain and any other factors that may influence our success. We must use our knowledge to make the most of every situation." He gestured to the young Orclings around them, who were wide-eyed with admiration. "And remember, always be prepared. It is an ancient Orcish wisdom not to march uphill against the enemy," Harguth began, "for it will only tire our soldiers and make them vulnerable. We must also be wary of engaging the enemy on their own ground, for they will have the advantage of the terrain." The Orclings watching intently, Zogga spoke up, "But what about when the enemy has the higher ground? What should we do then?" Harguth smiled and looked at Zogga. "That's a good question, young one. In that case, we must be clever and find ways to outwit the enemy. We can use our intelligence and knowledge of the terrain to our advantage, or create diversions or traps to confuse or distract them. The key is to be creative and think outside the box. We must not pursue an enemy who is feigning retreat," Harguth warned, his voice stern. "Let them think they have won and that we are beaten. We must also be careful not to attack those whose rage is strong or who are eager for battle." He paused for a moment, then added, "For if we do, we may find ourselves in an even worse position than before the fight began." Zul'jin nodded in agreement and gestured to the young Orclings by the fire. "Remember this lesson, my children," he said. "It is an ancient Orcish wisdom that will serve you well in times of war." Harguth nodded solemnly in agreement. "It is wise to remember that we must not be fooled by the enemy's false offers or interfere with an army that is returning home." He looked around at the young Orclings who had gathered around the fire and added, "If we are to succeed in this war, we must be patient and keep our wits about us. We must also remember that our strength lies in our numbers and that we must use them to our advantage." Zul'jin nodded in agreement. "Yes, it is important to remember that we must use our forces wisely and efficiently. We must also remain vigilant and alert to any changes in the enemy's tactics. We must always be prepared for battle." He paused for a moment before adding, "And we must never forget that our ultimate goal is to protect our people and our way of life. Our forces must be prepared for any eventuality," Harguth said. "We must surround the enemy, but leave an outlet open to prevent them from becoming desperate and pressing us too hard." He gestured with his hands to emphasize his words. Zul'jin nodded in agreement. "Yes," he said. "It is important to remember that sometimes a desperate enemy can be more dangerous than one that is not." The young Orclings around the fire listened intently, their eyes wide as they took in the wisdom of their elders. Zogga spoke up, asking, "What if we are the ones who are surrounded? What should we do?" Harguth smiled at the boy's curiosity. "In that case," he said, "we should use our knowledge of the terrain and our intelligence to find a way out. We must never underestimate the power of strategy and planning." Harguth nodded in agreement. "Indeed, such is the art of warfare." The two chiefs shared a moment of silence, before turning to the Orclings who were watching them intently. Harguth gave them a reassuring smile and said, "Remember, you are all warriors now. The fate of our people lies in your hands, so fight bravely and proudly." The Orc children around the fire began to grumble, obviously bored with the adult discussion. Harguth smiled and stood up, motioning for them all to stand. "Come now," he said, "it is time for us to return to the camp. Let us not forget what was discussed here tonight." With that, the group rose and began to make their way back to the winter camp of Harguth.